Let's talk about the difference between strings and bytes in Python. Strings represent text, that is human language. But there's another type that's closely associated with strings. This other type kind of looks like making a string with a B prefixed in front of it, sort of like an F before an F string or an R before a raw string. But this B doesn't actually make a string. It makes a bytes object. Strings represent text. Bytes objects represent binary data. If we loop over a string in Python, we'll get back substrings representing each of the characters in that string. What do you think we'll get if we loop over a bytes object? Bytes objects represent binary data, so when we loop over them, we get back numbers from 0 to 255 representing each of the bytes in that binary data. And we can also do the opposite of this. We can take an iterable of numbers and turn it into a bytes object by passing it to the bytes constructor. Now, strings are everywhere in Python. Where do we see bytes? It turns out all data that comes from outside of our Python process starts as bytes. But if that data represents text and Python knows it, Python will convert it to strings automatically. If we use the URL-lib module in Python to do an HTTP request, the data that we get back is not represented as a string. It's represented as a bytes object because it might not even represent text. HTTP request, after all, can send back any data, even arbitrary binary data. If we open up a file with the mode of RB, we're opening that file not in the default read text mode, but instead in read binary mode. So when we read from that file, the data that we get out of it will not be a string, it'll be a bytes object. And in fact, in this case, a bytes object with a lot of bytes in it because it takes a lot of bytes to represent an image. Now, if you end up with a bytes object in Python and you know that that object represents text, you can turn it into a string by calling its decode method. Now, with the decode method, without any arguments passed to it, it uses the default character encoding of UTF-8. Even if we know that the data that we're working with uses that default character encoding of UTF-8, it's usually considered a best practice to always specify the encoding of our bytes, because explicit is better than implicit. If, for some reason, you end up with a string and you want to turn it into bytes, you can do the opposite of this by calling the encode method on that string, encoding it into bytes. Just like decode, it defaults to UTF-8, but you could specify a different character encoding if you wanted a different character encoding. Strings represent text-based data. Bytes represent binary data, that is images, video, or anything else you could represent on a computer. Depending on what you use Python for, you probably won't encounter bytes objects very often. And when you do, probably the one thing you'll want to do with them is call their decode method to turn them into a string, that is assuming they represent text.